bring her back. Don't hurt her. Just bring her back. Let her go.
When people think of small-town America, the kind of place where you leave your front door unlocked, where bikes get left on porches, and the biggest event of the year might be the school fundraiser, they picture somewhere like Petaluma, California. In the early 90s, it was that kind of town. Sleepy, safe, a little postcard, perfect. The kind of place where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. Polly Klaas grew up right there, a bright, friendly 12-year-old with straight brown hair, curious eyes, and a confidence that comes with being surrounded by people who love you. She was in middle school, she had a wide circle of friends, and she had that pre-teen energy that just buzzed, a mix of childhood innocence and the first traces of independence. People described her as bubbly, polite, the kind of kid who would offer to help out without being asked. It was the 1st of October 1993, a Friday night. Polly had invited 2 of her close friends over for a slumber party. Something completely ordinary. Something every parent recognises instantly. Pizza, music, giggling in her bedroom. Her mum, Eve Nicole, had a new house in Petaluma. Cosy and lived in, filled with that happy noise of kids excited to stay up late. The girls were in Polly's room talking about school, trying on Halloween costumes. They were doing exactly what 12-year-old girls are supposed to be doing. By around 10 o'clock, the night had fallen silent outside. The Klaas house sat near a quiet intersection, surrounded by modest homes and tree-lined streets. Inside, the only sound was laughter behind a closed bedroom door, until a noise came from down the hallway. Something, a footstep, the creak of a floorboard, broke through their fun. At first, they thought it was Polly's mum walking by, or maybe the family cat. But when they looked up, the door opened, and there in the doorway stood a man. He was tall, muscular, unshaven, with wild hair and a stare that immediately drained the room of every trace of childhood energy. He held something in his hand, something silver, reflective. It took the girls a moment to realise it was a knife. The man told them not to scream. His voice was calm but heavy, the kind of voice that makes your chest lock up. He told them to lie face down on the floor. He used strips of cloth to tie their hands, steady movements like someone who'd done this before. One of the girls managed to whisper, "Please don't hurt us," and he told them he wouldn't, that he was only there to take their money and leave. But Polly didn't have money. None of them did. They were just kids at a slumber party. What happened next was chaotic but chillingly methodical. The man, later identified as Richard Allen Davis, took a pillowcase, slipped it over Polly's head, and told the other 2 girls not to move. He warned them that if they made a sound, he would kill them. Then, just like that, he led Polly out of the room, quiet, controlled, and disappeared into the October night. It was over in minutes. When Polly's mum went to check on them a short time later, the girls were sobbing, still tied up. The words jumbled out in panic. There was a man, and he took Polly. He had a knife. Eve called 911 immediately. Petaluma police responded within minutes, scanning the neighbourhood, setting up roadblocks. Word spread through the community like wildfire. In the hours that followed, neighbours come out with flashlights. Officers combed every backyard, every alley. The FBI was quickly brought in when it became clear this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a kidnapping. They knew that statistically, the most critical hours were the first 24. By morning, Polly's face was on local television. Her school picture, bright eyes, gentle smile, now attached to a word that should never describe a 12-year-old. Missing. That night marked the end of Petaluma's untouched innocence. The entire town turned itself inside out, looking for a child who had simply vanished from her own home. The next morning, the sunlight in Petaluma felt different. People remember it vividly. That strange quiet in the air, like everyone was holding their breath. The street in front of the Klaas home was sealed off with yellow tape. Police cars lined the block. Reporters gathered, cameras humming softly. The kind of scene that only happens after something terrible has already taken root. But right there, at the centre of it, was a mother desperate to find her daughter. Even Nicole wasn't just waiting, she joined in every effort she could. The same for her family, for her neighbours, for her friends. Within hours, posters with Polly's smiling school portraits were being photocopied by the hundreds, then the thousands. By the end of that first weekend, the town of roughly 25,000 people had swollen with volunteers. Teenagers, business owners, retirees, everyone was out searching. They combed parks, creeks, coverts. They posted flyers on every light pole, gas station window and highway sign. Have you seen Polly Klaas? The image was impossible to ignore. A 12-year-old girl, brown hair, warm eyes, missing from her own bedroom. The FBI quickly joined local authorities. Evidence technicians went through the Klaas house inch by inch, bagging fibres, fingerprints, the bindings used on the two friends. Every smudge, every scrape of material could be a clue. But in those early days, they had no suspect, no vehicle, and no clear trail. The account from Polly's friends was heartbreaking but crucial. A white male in his 30s or 40s, dishevelled, armed, calm but menacing. They worked with a sketch artist to create a composite image, a chillingly generic face that could have been 100 men in Northern California. Leads come pouring in, thousands of calls. Tips from supposed witnesses, psychics, people convinced they saw something. Every one of them had to be logged, checked and followed. Investigators said the volume was overwhelming and at times disheartening. So much noise and one tiny signal hidden somewhere inside. Meanwhile, Polly's case hit the national stage. Talk shows were covering it. Newspapers from coast to coast were updating readers daily. Celebrities joined appeals for information. Even the White House issued statements of concern. Suddenly, this wasn't just a small town tragedy. It was a reflection of every parent's worst nightmare in America. A child safe in her home vanished. The town transformed into the command centre of one of the largest child abduction searches the country had ever seen. Search teams formed grids across rural fields and dense brushland. Helicopters scouted from the air. Dogs sniffed for scent trails that faded too fast. For weeks, every new rumour tugged hope forward, only to crush it hours later. And yet, through all that chaos, fate had already put something in motion on that very night. Something no one understood at the time. Roughly 2 hours after Polly's abduction, another event completely separate, or so it seemed, was happening about 20 miles away near the town of Santa Rosa. A local homeowner called police to report a suspicious car stuck in a ditch on a private road. When deputies arrived, they found a man there behaving nervously. He claimed he'd gotten lost after visiting a friend. The man's name was Richard Allen Davis. The deputies ran his licence. He had a criminal record, mostly burglary, kidnapping, violent offences. But at that moment, he didn't appear to be actively committing a crime. They noted that he seemed flustered but cooperative, so they let him go. They had no idea that 2 hours earlier, and just a few miles away, he had allegedly kidnapped a child. When investigators later pieced that together, their frustration was palpable. The sheer nearness of it all, a brush with justice that had come and gone. For weeks, nothing broke. No ransom note, no phone call, no known sighting. The case hung suspended. Polly's family never stopped speaking publicly. Her father, Mark Klaas, became one of the most vocal, tireless advocates for her. He pushed for law enforcement cooperation across jurisdictions and for maintaining media attention. He was determined that his daughter's story would not fade into the background noise of America's tragedies. Then, in late November, nearly 2 months after the abduction, a crucial lead appeared. A small piece of cloth, consistent with the kind used to bind Polly's friends, was discovered off a rural road. Nearby were items that appeared to belong to Polly. The location was not random. It was actually close to where those deputies had once encountered Davis on that strange October night. From there, investigators zeroed in. Davis' name resurfaced, and when they reviewed his background more deeply, the alarm bell screamed. A repeat offender, a man who'd spent much of his adult life in prison for violent crimes, a man who should never have been free. Surveillance, interviews and evidence collection began, and in early December 1993, the break came. Davis was arrested after new forensic links tied him to the scene. The convergence of physical evidence, witness accounts, and his proximity to crucial points in the case left little doubt who their suspect was. The arrest did not bring relief, not yet, because what everyone still wanted most was clarity. Where was Polly? When police finally moved in on Richard Allen Davis in early December of 1993, they weren't approaching a mystery anymore. They were approaching a man whose history told them that whatever had happened to Polly was not going to have a gentle ending. Davis was picked up in Ukiah, California, a rugged rural area north of Petaluma. He had been staying near relatives, drifting between odd jobs and temporary housing. He looked rough and exhausted, but not surprised to see law enforcement arrive. The way several officers later put it, he almost seemed to expect them. When questioned, he was composed, defensive, the posture of someone who'd been through interrogations before. He'd spent nearly half his life in and out of prison. Burglary, assault, kidnapping. It was all in his record. But he denied taking Polly. He brushed off the idea as if it were absurd, insistently referring to himself as a changed man. Still, the investigators didn't stop. They had the physical evidence that they had collected. Fibres, bindings and prints. Everything was being compared, analysed, tightened into what would become an airtight case. While Davis stalled, the forensic timelines caught up. And here's where the investigation reached a devastating turning point. After repeated questioning and pressure, and after a key forensic link tied Davis's car to fibres consistent with those found at the scene, Davis changed his story. First, it was a reluctant admission that he had entered the home that night. Then, a cascade of partial confessions, one detail unlocking the next. Gradually, the timeline emerged, harsh but clear.
State for the record that the main reason I know that I did not attempt any lewd act that night was because of a statement the young girl made to me when walking her up the embankment. Just don't do me like my dad. I have to pay my dues, so should you.
Burn in hell, Davis.
All right, that concludes the statement.
Jacobs, do you have any comments you want to make?
On the night of the 1st of October, he had been drinking. Davis claimed he had been wandering, disorientated, when he entered the Klaas home through an unlocked door. What followed was deliberate, not random. He saw Polly and her friends in that room. The weapon in his hand was real, and after binding the two other girls, he took Polly. He told investigators that after leaving the house, he drove her away from Petaluma, heading towards rural Sonoma County. The hours after that were blank in his first accounts, evasive pauses. But investigators pressed harder. Eventually, he admitted what everyone most feared. Polly had not survived that night. In slow, fragmented speech, Davis described driving down a remote road, panicking about roadblocks and media reports that came sooner than he expected. The awareness that the world was looking for Polly seemed to send him spiralling. He made the decision, one of final cruelty, to silence her permanently. He would later guide investigators to the area where he left her remains, among dense thickets of a secluded road in Cloverdale, California, about 30 miles north of Petaluma. When search teams arrived at that spot, the evidence was there. Remnants of clothing, skeletal remains later confirmed through dental records and DNA to be Polly Klaas. It was the 4th of December, 1993, 2 months after she had been taken. That confirmation struck the community with a grief so heavy it was almost physical. The thousands of volunteers who had combed hillsides and searched streams now joined candlelit vigils instead. Entire neighbourhoods lined their doorways with white ribbons. Law enforcement officers who had been working the case for weeks were visibly shaken. Even hardened professionals admitted that this case was one of the most emotionally draining of their entire careers. Davis, meanwhile, remained detached. In court appearances, his demeanour changed between smug and expressionless. He seemed to enjoy the attention, a bitter echo of other killers who clung to their infamy as the only power. But investigators who interviewed him said something deeper was at play. A man whose life had been built on cycles of incarceration, release, relapse and violence. His criminal record stretched back to his teens, with multiple chances at rehabilitation that went nowhere. It soon became apparent that Polly's death was preventable in the most literal sense. Davis should not have been free. He had been paroled just months before the abduction. It reignited national debates about sentencing laws, parole oversight, and the pattern of violent repeat offenders slipping through cracks in the system. As Davis was charged with kidnapping and murder via strangulation, public anger turned into something louder: demand. People wanted legal change. They wanted to know why a man with such a record had been given another chance, and how many others like him were out there. Through all this, Polly's family, stunned, grieving, and suddenly at the epicentre of a national story, began helping channel their outrage into purpose. Her father, Mark Klaas, appeared frequently in interviews, not just to mourn but to advocate for reform. He spoke candidly about his loss, but also about failures in the criminal justice that allowed it to happen. When the case of the people versus Richard Allen Davis went to trial, the state of California was already brimming with rage and exhaustion. The disappearance of Polly hadn't just broken one family, it had broken an idea. The comforting illusion of safety that so many communities thought they had. By the time Davis appeared before a judge, the entire country knew his name. The wheels of justice moved slowly, but the evidence was unshakable. Forensic specialists built a timeline around every particle, every fibre, every hair strand recovered from Davis's car. Witnesses traced his movements, linking his vehicle back to the rural roads where search teams found fragments of the duct tape and cloth used to restrain the girls. Luminal tests picked up traces that told a silent but certain story. In court, prosecutors framed it bluntly. This was an abduction, an assault, and a deliberate murder, committed by a man who had been given every warning, every second chance, and chose violence again. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was tense, heavy with restrained emotion. Reporters filled the benches. Polly's family sat quietly, dignified, but visibly anguished. What struck observers most wasn't just the brutality of the crime, but the composure of the defendant. Davis sat there, attentive but mostly indifferent, sometimes smirking, sometimes scribbling notes as if the proceedings were a performance put on just for him. When the prosecution showed jurors photographs of evidence recovered from the disposal site, mild images by legal standards but deeply painful, the jurors looked stunned. There were no outbursts, no theatrics, just a collective understanding that what had been done to Polly could never be undone and never rationalised. Throughout the trial, Davis's lawyers attempted to portray him as intoxicated, impulsive, even remorseful in fleeting moments. But the facts dismantled that narrative piece by piece. His history of violent crime, his repeated opportunities for rehabilitation, the cold nature of his confession. None of it pointed to loss of control, it all pointed to intent. During a sentencing hearing, after weeks of evidence and expert testimony, Davis was given a chance to speak. And instead of remorse, he delivered a cruel taunt, claiming without credibility that Polly had said something that angered him, that somehow she was at fault. The courtroom gasped. Even hardened reporters wrote that silence exploded into fury. That display erased whatever shred of sympathy anyone might have considered. Mark Klaas, Polly's father, sat there, composed but burning from the inside out. He didn't flinch, didn't shout, but later in interviews he said that was the moment he realised absolute evil isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just indifferent. When the verdict was finally read, there was no surprise. Guilty on all counts. Kidnapping, murder, and the special circumstances that made the crime capital. The jury recommended the death penalty. The judge agreed. In presenting the sentence, the court spoke plainly. Davis's crime had been calculated, sadistic, and without justification. He was sentenced to death and transferred to St. Quentin State Prison, where he remains to this day. Years of appeals followed, but none changed the outcome. For many, that verdict brought justice. For others, especially in Polly's circle, it brought a quiet emptiness. Justice in form, but not in heart. The one thing they wanted most could not be returned. Yet, even in grief, change was already forming. Legislators and advocates drew direct lines from Davis's case to systematic failures in California's parole system. Within a year, their outrage helped push through one of the most significant legal initiatives the state had seen in decades. 3 strikes and you're out. The idea was simple, if blunt. Repeat offenders who committed 3 serious or violent felonies would face life imprisonment. Supporters credited Polly's case for galvanising public momentum behind it. Mark Klaas became not just a grieving father, but a national advocate for tougher sentencing laws and for child safety initiatives. He created the Polly Klaas Foundation, dedicated to helping families of missing children and reforming policies around child abduction response. What her father built in the aftermath turned pain into service. Over the next several years, Polly's story influenced technology too. National databases of missing children become faster and more coordinated. The early mechanics that would later evolve into the Amber Alert system drew on lessons learned from her case. The urgency of those first hours, how law enforcement and the public could move as one. As the years passed, Petaluma slowly changed shape again. The posters came down, the television crews left, but the absence remained. For the people there, the volunteers who searched night after night. It was an open wound that never quite closed, even decades later. In interviews, many said the image they remember most isn't from the investigation or the trial, but from the first candlelight vigil. 1,000 people standing quietly on the streets where Polly had played, holding small flames against the California dusk. The town illuminated by grief and solidarity. Because when something like that happens, a community fractures, but it also hardens, reshapes itself into a promise to remember, to protect, to never again take the safety for granted. After the trial ended and the speeches faded, Petaluma didn't just move on, it rebuilt carefully, deliberately. The Klaas house was eventually sold, the neighbourhood resumed its rhythms, but the shadow never completely left. The people who lived through the autumn of 1993 say every siren, every missing child report that hits the news still takes them back to that night. Mark Klaas, Polly's father, never stopped working. He turned his grief into motion, founding the Polly Klaas Foundation just months after the sentencing. Its bright pink logo, a colour Polly loved, became a symbol of advocacy. The foundation helped coordinate searches for missing children across the country, offering both emotional and logistical help. If you go to Petaluma today, you'll find an oak-lined street not far from downtown with a small park named after Polly. It's quiet, children's laughter mingling with the sound of the wind through the trees. There's a plaque with her name, surrounded by flowers. People stop and some of them cry. Some leave small trinkets or notes, and sometimes you'll see school groups come through with their teachers. Learning just not about tragedy, but about response, how communities can turn pain into protection. The local theatre hosts an annual benefit for the foundation. The proceeds go to child safety education. There's a quiet pride in how the town carries her story, not as an open wound anymore, but as a vow. St. Quentin still holds Richard Allen Davis. His appeals are long, his sentence unfulfilled, and California's death penalty system remains tangled in politics and procedure. But for most people, especially those who lived through the era, the legal fate of one man matters far less than what came after him. What endures isn't the ugliness of what he did, but the strength of what followed. A father who turned despair into movement, a town that refused to sink into silence, a national reckoning with how we define justice, and more than anything, the memory of a child whose name we still say because she changed something very real in the world. Thank you for listening today, and remember, stay behind the yellow tape.